There are so many interesting aspects of both the great violin concertos and the performance record that one is faced with a hard choice to skimp on both and comment only on their highlights, or to discuss one alone, not both, with some thoroughness. Mendelssohn's music you recognize it instantly without looking at a program. This music is so deeply entrenched in the orchestral repertoire that there will surely be good opportunity later on in this series to discuss the outstanding characteristics of his style and the subtleties of its formal structure. Therefore, I shall confine myself solely to the discussion of the Prokofiev work, since he is more of our day and has, let us say, more unorthodox habits of composition. To survey them briefly would hardly be satisfactory. An interruption almost as abrupt as that occurred in 1933. In that year, at the peak of his career, Prokofiev voluntarily cut himself off from freedom of travel and thought and returned from his residence in southern France to take up life in Moscow, a few miles from his birthplace. Two questions have intrigued musicians, critics, and audiences since that time. First, why did he go back to the USSR when he was not officially required to? And secondly, what effect did the dictatorship of thought within Russia at that time have upon his creative output since then, a period which includes such major compositions as his Second Violin Concerto? It is my feeling that a study of this concerto will give us a partial answer at least to the second question, about the quality of his creative thinking since his return to his homeland. To give a background to the answer, to understand it better, we must first examine the position of Prokofiev in 1933, his international reputation as a composer and performer, as well as his position as one of the keenest minds and sharpest tongues of contemporary Russia. In 1913, his ballet, Allah and Loli, which is based on primitive Russian legends, was commissioned by the remarkable Diaghilev after a meeting in Paris, a singular honor for a composer barely out of the conservatory and just turned 23. With its weird dissonances and its original orchestration, Prokofiev tried to outdo the massive shock of Stravinsky's ballet, The Rites of Spring, produced a year before. Although for various reasons the ballet was not produced, Diaghilev softened the blow by producing several other Prokofiev ballets in Paris, London, Milan, and New York in the next 15 years. Prokofiev was also known throughout Europe and America as a phenomenal pianist. He appeared in all the great capitals, not only in the classics, but as an interpreter of his own works, such as the great Third Piano Concerto. Whose premiere took place in Chicago in 1921. In his student years at the Petersburg Conservatory, he had studied orchestration with Rimsky-Korsakov. Harmony with Lyadov. composition with Glier and Tanev. With these great teachers as guides, it was not surprising that his orchestral compositions, such as his first symphony, the Classical Symphony, became part of the standard repertoire of orchestras throughout the world. Besides, Prokofiev held an almost unique position among Soviet artists. He possessed a Soviet passport and yet was allowed to travel freely in Europe and America and reap the singular rewards of unhampered intellectual contact with the great creative minds of the West, be they voluntary Russian emigres such as Stravinsky or Diaghilev, or foreign artists such as the Scottish singer Mary Garden, who was responsible for the first production of his opera, The Love of the Three Oranges. Or the German surrealist painter Max Ernst, or the famous six compositeurs terribles of Paris, Milhaud, Honegger, and company. But, as we have seen, in 1933, Prokofiev, at the height of his international fame and at the peak of his inventive prowess, voluntarily returned to the Soviet Union. He accepted the concomitant limitations on travel and contact with the outside world, the lower standards of physical existence, the overwhelming jealousies of lesser political composers, but worst of all, the subtle but insidious control by the state of all thinking. Why did he make this decision to give up his independent life as a free artist? Actually, we can only speculate. We will never know. He carried the secret to his grave 20 years later, in March 1953, 3 days after the death of Joseph Stalin, once his friend and patron. Let us then proceed to the other question: what effect his return to the USSR had on his creative output. Here we need not resort to speculation, for we in the West have heard most of the 40 major compositions he wrote from the year 1933 until his death. Some of these compositions have become contemporary classics, such as Peter and the Wolf, Romeo and Juliet, the music for the film Alexander Nevsky, and above all, this great second violin concerto. My own belief is that whatever his personal reasons for returning, none of them affected the quality of his output in the least, or changed his style either positively or negatively. If we examine the general qualities of Prokofiev's style, those characteristics which allow us to recognize a composition as his after we have heard but a few measures, we will see that all these characteristics, which are abundantly apparent in his earlier works, are present in the second violin concerto, but in a more defined and mature form. For example, one of Prokofiev's most personal characteristics is humor, musical humor, which titillates our ears as well as our minds. This shows itself in many forms, grotesque leaps, such as we find in the first piano concerto, written in 1910 when Prokofiev was still a student at the Conservatory. The second violin concerto is full of such grotesque leaps. Listen to an angular theme from the otherwise gentle first movement. Even his simplest themes have their jagged edges, as in this one from the lyrical second movement. Here, and here, the last movement, which is a scherzo, would be more likely to have these grotesque leaps. In fact, one of the subordinate themes in the movement is made up entirely of awkward bounces away from and back to an even diatonic plane. Prokofiev's musical humor shows in other ways. For instance, his sudden shifts to unexpected keys, like a perky dog playing hide-and-seek with its master. His earlier works are full of such examples. One of the most obvious is the famous march from The Love of the Three Oranges. All of a sudden, for no apparent reason, we are in this distant key. This musical game of hide-and-seek is more refined in the second violin concerto, but you will still find it there. Take, for example, the opening of the gay third movement. We dance along nonchalantly in one key. So far, all is well. Suddenly, Prokofiev shifts, for no accountable reason, to this key. And again to this, where he remains for a little while. He even starts a repetition of the theme in this new key, about as distant harmonically as he could get from his original home base. Listen. But all of a sudden, everything is magically all right. We have dodged all over the place, but returned abruptly to where we started from, and where we evidently should be. Listen to the entire passage in sequence, and you will undoubtedly feel that the seemingly arbitrary shifts, which make us laugh inwardly at their unexpectedness, are guided by a sure and positive hand. Even one of his most lyrical creations, the theme of the second movement, moves at one point rather suddenly to a distant key. So far, we are on an even keel. We move only slightly away. But suddenly, as the orchestra takes up the theme, we are in entirely foreign waters. And just as suddenly, we are well established back home in our original key. Another form of Prokofiev's humor, which is very noticeable in his early works, is what one might call his predilection for harmonic blotches, the most aggravating discords in the midst of conventional chord patterns. One of the most noticeable of these shock sequences is in the early piano composition, Diabolical Suggestion, Opus 4. In the close of the last movement of the second violin concerto, we see that Prokofiev has lost none of this ability to surprise his listeners by the use of intentional discords. Listen first to the chord scheme, or rather discord scheme, played slowly. Now hear this passage played in tempo, and notice how the shock value evaporates, leaving only a pleasantly peppery sensation. At the end of the first movement, you will also hear some of these harmonic blotches. But all ends quietly and well. One of Prokofiev's most endearing qualities is his unabashed lyricism, at a time when most of his contemporaries were self-conscious about flowing melodies. All of his works, from the earliest to the latest, abound in opulent and singable melodies. Nothing could be more rich nor sweet than the main theme of the first violin concerto, written in 1925. And even within the harshness of his early ballet, Alla and Loli, written in 1913, one finds oases of pure song, such as this following passage. This lyricism seems to have gained in power after 1933. The Second Violin Concerto is probably one of the most tuneful of all violin concertos since Tchaikovsky and Brahms. Listen to the Tchaikovskyan lushness of the second theme of the first movement. And like Tchaikovsky, he is loath to give up the song and repeats it with only slight alterations in the accompaniment. The very opening theme of the first movement, played by the violin alone, although it is in minor, is one of the most haunting creations of Prokofiev. The second, the slow movement, is one long song from beginning to end. We have already heard its opening theme in another connection, but let us listen again and bask in its melodic beauty. Even the bouncy, scherzo-like third movement has its tender, tuneful moments. As to orchestration, Prokofiev was always a polished technician from his earliest works. These very early pieces contain the most startling and ingenious instrumental effects. Listen to the brilliant complexity of this passage from the early Scythian suite. And the same man, a few years later, could achieve an orchestral sound simple and translucent as this passage from the classical symphony. That sure painter of orchestral tones lost none of his skill or originality when, in 1933, he returned to the USSR, supposedly to work in conformity with government-dictated aesthetic directives. The second violin concerto uses only a small classical-sized orchestra, such as Haydn, Beethoven, or Mendelssohn might have used. But with it, Prokofiev can achieve the most varied colors. They can be harsh, as in this passage from the first movement, and then evaporate into sweetness, or they can be consistently harsh, as here in the last movement. His colors can be weird, such as these glissandos in another part of the third movement. He can create unearthly shimmering effects, such as this passage from the second movement. Here he proves himself the equal of the Impressionist composers such as Ravel. In the same movement, he can create sounds as rich and as sensuous as any passages from the Romantic composers such as Elgar or Strauss. He can produce brilliant sounds, as in this important theme from the third movement. Or, in the first movement, he can be purposely dark gray. Or angular and opaque, as here. Prokofiev was essentially a classicist among contemporary composers. One manifestation of this classicism that has always been noticeable is his love of classical dance forms, the minuet, the gavotte, the rigodon, etc. One of his earliest published works was a gavotte for piano. And the second movement of his great third piano concerto could easily be the accompaniment to a formal court dance, a pavane. Likewise, this second violin concerto is full of dance rhythms. A slow waltz in the second movement, the beginning of the last movement is a typical Austrian Ländler. And later on in the same movement, he imitates the uneven rhythm of a Russian folk dance, perhaps a kazatska. Now the melody disappears and we just hear the rhythm of the dance. So, in review, we can see that all the basic characteristics of Prokofiev's music, his humor, his genius at orchestration, his love of classical dance forms, and his unbounded lyricism. All of these strictly personal manifestations of his style, those trademarks which make us aware that this music is Prokofiev's and no one else's, these traits were present in his earliest pieces, and they are also present, only perhaps more highly developed, in the masterpieces such as this great concerto, which were written after he voluntarily retired behind the Iron Curtain. They serve to show us, as no other type of communication could, that, whether Prokofiev musically conformed to Soviet official policy or not, whether he pleased his chosen audience or not, he was and always remained a free thinker artistically, a man far above being marred by any ideology, a man not of one country alone, but of the entire world.